Good afternoon, Canada. Welcome to another True North Report. My name is Andrew LAWTON, a fellow with True North, here to talk about guns. Yes, I know people are going to say that this isn't the most pressing concern facing Canada, and I agree. I think there are a number of issues that we have going on in the country, issues that we have to deal with and that our politicians need to deal with. But I'm a firm believer, as I've said time and time again, that we need to deal with government overreach when it happens, where it happens, even if it's not going to be the hill to die on for a lot of people, because eventually you run out of hills. And this is where we are right now. I've talked about this a number of times in the past, and I actually was feeling for a little while like, people might be getting a little bit sick of it, but a couple of things happened. Number one, I see the response that I get to videos anytime I talk about firearms, because there is a huge appetite out there. But more importantly, I see the fact that government continues to give me reasons to talk about what they're doing on guns and what they're doing on firearms policy, and this week has been no exception to this. So if you are a gun owner, do listen, because I think you'll get a lot of material out of here that you can work with that's important. If you are not a gun owner and maybe are not interested in firearms, maybe don't even like firearms, I would still recommend you listen, because I think that you'll learn that a lot of the themes that we see emerging in the gun debate are things that are really ubiquitous throughout other areas of politics. I mean, when the government is prepared to use what is basically nonsense or dishonest rhetoric to take away any group's rights, they could do it with any issue. It doesn't have to remain confined to firearms. So when you look at how the government is justifying trying to restrict firearms usage, these are things that could happen to non-gun owners as well. And I did a little video about this yesterday, but there's a lot else that's happening that I wanted to expand on. So welcome. I see a couple of people joining the chat. Hello, Phil. If you want to weigh in the comments, anyone, do so. We'll take some questions as the live stream goes on. And if you have questions, again, you don't need to be an expert in guns. You don't even need to have ever held one before. This is ultimately a discussion about rights and about government overreach more than it is about the specifics of the firearms hobby in Canada, though we will talk a fair bit about that as well. I want to start with how this really came about, because you had over the weekend in the US the horrific shootings in El Paso and Dayton, and I think these were, just given the proximity of them to one another, they were really difficult. Because when you're talking about a matter of one day and someone says, oh, wow, that shooting is terrible, and you have to say which one, it's a terrible sign of where things are in society that this is happening. And conversely, you also look at Canada and see that Toronto had 14 different shootings in the same weekend over a 72-hour period, 17 people shot over 14 separate shootings, and this gets a fraction of the media coverage. In fact, even Canadian media was focused more on the El Paso and Dayton shootings than the Toronto shootings. Now, there are a couple of reasons for this. Number one, the US shootings just had a greater death toll. It's sad, it's tragic, but they did. So people are more inclined to talk about wherever the death toll is the highest. But also, they were conventional, or what we view as conventional shootings, whereas it's a mass shooting. It's not the typical gang violence that is so common in inner cities that it doesn't even warrant a front page mention. And this is where things just get so difficult, in that no one in Canada or in the US wants to devote the same attention to shootings that are happening in inner city Toronto, that are happening in Chicago, that are happening in Baltimore, Philadelphia, that are happening in inner cities, because it's a lot easier to focus on the mass shootings where you can then politicize it to make it about gun control. Whereas when you look at shootings that are happening in South Chicago or in Toronto, no one is talking about gun control, because we're talking by and large about gangs that are illegally using illegally obtained firearms, illegal guns used for illegal and illicit purposes. So gun control is not going to do anything. And that brings us back to where we are with the Toronto issues, because in Toronto, these shootings, and we don't yet have the full breakdown of what happened where, but from looking at the profile and the locations, these are gang related. They just are. I know that's uncomfortable for people to say, and it's not that they're less significant. It's that we're talking about a segment of the population that doesn't quite care about gun laws or gun regulations or safe transport guidelines or the conditions attached to your possession and acquisition license. We're talking about a demographic in, gang-connected people that doesn't care about that, because they've already broken. And Brian Lilly referenced this in a column he wrote in The Sun. And I actually want to read it because I've made the point before, but he worded it in a very good way. Those carrying illegal handguns are already in violation of about a half dozen criminal code offenses, including illegal possession of a firearm, illegal transportation of a firearm, and more. Yet suddenly, these criminal code violations, which can lead to multi-year sentences, will prompt criminals to drop their illegal guns if we add a ban on top of everything. It's absurd. You can't just add one more ban, one more regulation, and expect that people who have shown a profound disdain for the law will start to follow the law. But that's exactly what the gun grabbers like John Tory and the NDP and the Globe and Mail editorial board are all pretending will happen. So we're back to the question of how the rhetoric used in this debate tends to obscure and muddle the debate. And we saw this coming from Justin Trudeau. We saw it coming from John Tory. We see it coming from the media in Canada. I want to read, and this was what I ultimately did the video on yesterday, the words that were used in a Toronto Star article that I think explain very much where the anti-gun community is coming here. And I'm going to read two different versions of the story. This was an article in the Toronto Sun that quoted Wendy Sukier. Now, her name is spelled C-U-K-I-E-R. It's not Kukier, it's Sukier. So let's not go with the Kukier pronunciation, apt as it may be. The article writes this: asked for her thoughts on how Toronto could be experiencing a surge in the number of shootings, but a decline in gun-related deaths, Sukier, the Coalition for Gun Control president, said that legal gun owners tend to be more effective in killing people because they spend time at target practice or hunting. Quote, one of the terrible ironies is that when you see the proliferation of guns often associated with gang violence, you have lots of shootings, but fewer people are killed, perhaps because they don't spend hours and hours at the shooting range, she said. So that's version one. Fast forward, I think it was about 12 hours, and this is the version of the article that appears online. Asked for her thoughts on how Toronto could be experiencing a surge in the number of shootings, but a decline in gun-related deaths, Sukier, the Coalition for Gun Control president, pointed to examples of fatal shootings involving legal gun owners, such as the January 2017 Quebec City mosque shooting. In those cases, it could be that experience with guns led to a more lethal outcome, she said, and then it's followed by the same quote. So you have in the first version of this story a resolute and specific claim that lawful law-abiding gun owners are more effective at killing people than gang shooters are. And then that switches to a story of, well, maybe law-abiding gun owners could be more effective at killing people because they have more experience. And I've reached out to the Toronto Star. I've not yet received a response. I reached out to an editor with a very specific question. Was this change made because the reporter got it wrong in the first version, or was it changed at the request of the source, of Wendy Sukier, because she didn't like how it made her sound? Just reading, no, sorry, I thought there was a line I missed there. No, I read the whole thing. So this is what we're up against right now. And gun owners were very outraged about this. I've seen Wendy Sukier's face memed by a lot of gun owners who are very frustrated in her claim, making the baseless claim that law-abiding gun owners are more effective at killing people. And even if this is true, because her point is that if you own a gun and you spend hours at the range, you're better at using it and you've got better aim. So if you were to use that to shoot a person, yes, you'd be more likely to get your target than someone else would be. But it completely misses the point when she's conceding in that same quote that law-abiding gun owners aren't doing that. That's like saying, yes, I could drive 250 kilometers an hour without batting an eye if I were in a Ferrari, but I don't have a Ferrari, so it's a moot point. Why? Like, yes, I could do that if I had the means to do it. And law-abiding gun owners with experience could, kill someone if they were going to kill someone, but they aren't. And the stats show that law-abiding gun owners are, by and large, and this is statistically proven, safer than even the general population. By virtue of having a gun license, I believe the latest research from Gary Mauser says I am 1/3 as likely to commit murder as some random person who's not armed on the street, or who's not lawfully armed on the street. So this is what we're up against. People trying to claim that law-abiding gun owners have to shoulder the brunt of gun violence when the stats say the complete opposite. But unfortunately, if you start talking about handguns or assault weapons, and I've done videos in the past on why assault weapon is really a made-up term in the Canadian context. An AR-15 is not a fully automatic rifle. It's not an assault rifle. But when you have the Liberals and the Globe and Mail editorial board and the Toronto Star and the columnists and the activists and all of these people saying we've got to ban handguns and ban assault rifles and all of this stuff, what you see happening is a lot of Canadians who are not gun owners, and gun owners are a sizable group. I think there are about 2.2 million licensed gun owners in Canada. It's a sizable group, but it's still a statistical minority in Canada. When you've got people saying, guns are violent and we don't want guns, there aren't enough people with experience in this area who can speak up and say, well, hang on, I don't think that's right. I don't think that's right that you would target this group of people who have done nothing wrong, who are posing no threat, no risk, and no harm to anyone. But that's what we see happening here. And for the Liberals, I've said in the past that it tends to be somewhat of a safe bet if the Liberals want to go after gun owners because A, they're not alienating their own voters, and B, most people in cities don't even know how relatively common guns are in the first place. So someone in a city is going to be like, yeah, why does anyone need a handgun? Yeah, I'm going to vote for this. The Liberals don't want handguns, and the Conservatives do, and the PPC do, and the NDP don't. So I'll choose between the Liberal and the NDP. So we do need to speak out about the truth on this area. And I'm a firm believer in the fact that the media should educate themselves on guns. I think anyone who writes about crime stories, anyone who writes about guns should actually go and get their possession and acquisition license, know what it is that goes into it, so that when a story does come along, okay, well, actually, I had to do this. So this person that they're saying is a shooter probably hadn't done that, because otherwise this would have been revealed. Need I remind you that gun owners or licensed gun owners in Canada are background checked every day. You are subject to a warrantless home inspection if the police just knock on your door and say, hey, we need to make sure you're storing things properly. And you can have your property seized at any point for even the slightest or unintentional of issues. Michael writes, shared. Thank you very much, Michael. Really appreciate the support. So all of this is to say that the debate right now is being had on facts that are not real facts. But there is a little bit of an upside here. There's a little bit of an upside, and I'll share this with you because I think that as we near the election, we run out of time for the government right now, the Liberal government, to do anything as a government. All they can really do after a certain point is talk about things they'll do if they get reelected. Let me just pull up this article here. So this is from a CBC piece, Why Ottawa is Hedging When It Comes to Handguns. And it's from Jonathan Gatehouse, who says government is weighing the results of last year's consultations on tougher gun control measures. Ralph Goodale, the public safety minister, did an interview on Power and Politics, and he said, quote, it's appropriate for the political parties to lay out for Canadians where they would go with this particular issue, noting that any legislative changes will have to wait for Parliament's return. So he's saying we are not doing anything as a government. We are going to put forward our vision as part of our platform in the next election. And I think that the reason he's doing this is because the Liberals have done their polling, they've done their research, they've done all of this stuff, and I think they've probably come to an understanding that it's not as politically safe as they think it is. It's not as politically safe as they think it is which means that they have to really be very careful if they're going to put forward something that risks threatening people's rights, people's property, whatever the case may be. And that's what this is going to come down to. The Liberals, you can mock them all you want, but they're not stupid. They want to stay in power. They want to stay in office, which means that if there's something that's going to just profoundly blow up in their face, they're going to try to avoid it. And I think that when they look at the rural population, the urban-rural divide, people outside of Toronto and outside of big cities, of which there are still millions in this country, they must be aware that, okay, if we tell these groups we're going to take away your guns, it's not going to look pretty for us. And I think it was also Brian Lilley. I know I'm quoting him a lot, but he's a great guy. He's a good friend. I think it was Brian Lilley who said, you know that if the Liberals, who have been talking for years about wanting to do a handgun ban, are not doing it right now, they know how politically disadvantageous it would be. If they thought there was even a percentage point they could go up in the polls by trying to ban handguns, they would. So they are going to do it by virtue of running on it and then doing it if they win again. But there also is another dimension to this, which is what they're going to do about the so-called assault weapons issue. And again, I've talked about this in the past. We've got to have a bit of an honest look at what assault rifles are, and what an assault rifle actually is already banned in Canada. You can't have a fully automatic firearm in Canada unless you're one of a tiny, tiny, tiny number of people that has a prohibited license and had it grandfathered in, and we're talking about a minuscule number of these guns that would exist in Canada. And no one else can. They're prohibited. They are absolutely prohibited. So when people talk about assault rifles, what they're actually talking about typically are AR-15s, variants of the civilian versions of military rifles that by their design are made to not be fully automatic, to be semi-automatic, like a lot of non-restricted hunting rifles are. And these things, again, because of a lack of understanding, are very likely to be included in any sort of ban. And the Liberals have already talked about this, of wanting to ban what Bill Blair said are guns used to hunt people. But the reason I go back to that quote, and I think I might have done a live when that happened some months ago, things that are used to hunt people, is because it's very similar to the rhetoric we have from Wendy Sukier. So just a couple of months ago, Bill Blair is on question period with Evan Solomon, and he says the government wants to restrict guns that are used to hunt people. And then you fast forward to the Toronto Star on Tuesday of this week, or Tuesday night, Wednesday morning, and Wendy Sukier of the Coalition for Gun Control is saying that gun owners, legal gun owners, are more effective in killing people because they spend time at target practice or hunting. You cannot be a legal gun owner and be effective at killing people, because once you start to use your gun to kill people, shockingly, you're no longer a legal gun owner. You aren't. You are no longer following the law. You're no longer abiding by the law. You're no longer behaving lawfully. And these are not the people that are owning Canada's guns legally. Now, what was interesting here, and we see this in the rhetoric coming from the Liberals now, is they've started to walk back because of, I think, a lot of the efforts from, I don't want to sound too arrogant, but people like me and Brian Lilley, people like gun lobbyists, people that have been unrelenting in wanting to talk about these issues over the last few months. But you have them starting to realize that, okay, we can no longer blame crime guns on domestic legally owned firearms that then became crime guns. We know that there is an issue in guns crossing the border. There was a Global News piece this week where Christian Leuprecht from the Royal Military College was quoted on this, and he said, look, we share a border with one of the largest gun-producing nations in the world. It also happens to be the largest unprotected border in the world. So you can't expect that we can manage our supply without having to deal with guns being imported illegally from the U.S. But the thing is, there's another point to this that I think is valuable. And that is that I don't want the neighboring America thing to become too much of a focal point. And the reason I say that is because Phelim McAleer and Ann McElhenney, two very smart people that I think are just absolutely fantastic voices, and they just launched a podcast out of the U.S. They're Irish. Well, actually, she's Irish. He's Northern Irish. They're a married couple who now lives in California, and they're great conservative filmmakers, documentarians, and now podcast hosts. And this week, it was yesterday, Fela McAleer's podcast, or said on the podcast, that he's from Northern Ireland, which is an island off of an island off of an island, basically. It is entirely isolated in the sense of the easiest to secure, and even Northern Ireland, which had among the strictest gun control in the world, was a place where thousands of people, women and children even, were gunned down with illegal guns. So even a literal island was not able to protect itself from illegal firearms. And this is the case with Australia, whereas you have in Australia a literal island nation that, despite its gun grab, has still seen firearms crime. They've still seen firearms crime, and not in insignificant numbers, despite having a nationwide gun confiscation several years ago under, believe it or not, a conservative in John Howard. I want to read a comment here from Lars, who writes, when 60% of gun crimes in Canada involve handguns, I say get rid of them specifically now, increase penalties for gun smuggling, and establish firm regulations on any type of weapon that might be construed as an assault rifle. So first off, I appreciate you listening and watching, Lars, and I appreciate you commenting. When you say get rid of them specifically now, what are you even talking about? Why should I have to get rid of my handguns when my handguns and those owned by people like me who have gone through the background checks, they're registered, they're stored in a certain way, when our guns are not the ones being used in gun crimes, why should we have to get rid of them? I agree with you on gun smuggling. I think if anyone is illegally importing firearms into Canada, throw the book at them, lock them up, deport them if that's what need be. As far as regulations on guns that could be construed as an assault rifle, we already have these. We already have classifications. The problem is that the media definition of an assault rifle is different than the actual definition of an assault rifle. The media definition, even Bill Blair's definition, now that he's a politician, the Liberal Party's definition is different than the actual definition. If we focus on the actual definition, boom, assault rifles are already banned. The guns that are used in mass shootings are not going to matter, because if you ban one model, anyone who is prone to violence will use a different model. And I did a video, which was actually a very important video, and I'm glad I did it. It was in defense of the AR-15, and I just bought one recently. I haven't fired it yet, but I have it. I own it. And the AR-15 is one of the most popular guns because of it's fun to shoot, it's easy to shoot, it's customizable, and you can do a lot with it. The reason it's used in more mass shootings than anything else is not because it's a more violent or deadly or lethal gun, it's because it's a more popular gun. And the comparison that I gave when I did that video is that if, let's say, the Honda Civic is the most popular car on the road right now, statistically, the Honda Civic is going to end up in far more car accidents than the Maserati or the Porsche Cayenne or the Mazda 3. So that doesn't mean Honda Civics are more fatal. It means that Honda Civics you see in larger numbers, ergo, it's going to be more represented in negative things that happen on the road. And that's true of the AR-15s. So we don't need to re-regulate or further regulate assault rifles. And more importantly, just because 60% of gun crimes involve handguns, we don't need to get rid of the legal handguns, the lawfully owned handguns, which just simply are not ending up used as parts of crime. And there's no way about it. So this is not a necessary concession. More importantly, it's a dangerous concession because it allows the gun grabbers to incrementally move further and further towards nationwide disarmament, which benefits absolutely no one except the government, except the elites that don't want anyone to own firearms. And I must say again, because people always bring up the question of, well, who needs it? We are not a nation of needs. We are not a society of needs. Most people don't need a 4-bedroom house. Most people don't need 2 cars in their household. Most people don't need to buy brand name, tomato sauce instead of no-name tomato sauce. Most people don't need a Mac instead of a computer. Most people don't need a cell phone. I mean, the fact is we do not define what we are allowed to own in a free country by what we need. We define it by what we want and what does not interfere with the rights of others. And me owning a gun when I've gone through all of these different steps and stages threatens no one's rights, no one's right to life, no one's right to safety, but disarming me or any other gun owner would threaten our rights. It's that simple. It is that simple. And when people try to use El Paso and Dayton and other horrific shootings, for which I genuinely offer my thoughts and prayers, even though this has become a line that people mock, when people try to use these incidents and import that baggage into Canada to change our gun laws, this is where I go back to people needing to understand how our gun laws work in Canada. We already quite effectively managed to keep guns out of the hands of mass shooters. We have a much better system for mental health care. We have a much better system for background checks, reference checks. I do think that there are some areas where what we have is too restrictive, but our gun regime in Canada is apples to oranges when stacked up against the gun regime in the US, which is why you see things happening in greater numbers there that don't happen in Canada, despite how many millions of firearms there are in circulation. I know at one time I heard this, I don't know if it's still true, but at one point we had more long guns per capita than anywhere else in the world, even more than the US, and that was referring to mainly hunting rifles and stuff. And I mean, the US certainly takes the cake as far as civilian ownership of handguns is concerned. And like I said, I don't know if that number is still valid, but I do know that it's very high. The amount of guns that exist in Canada that are in, I don't know if circulation is the right word, but that exist in civilian homes, trucks, hunting cabins, whatever. And the fact that we have this without having a country that seems like it is unsafe or at risk of excessive gun violence everywhere says that what we do is working. And because of what we're doing is so effective, why do we need to disarm anyone? When you look at Toronto having rapidly increasing rates of shootings, this is not something that has ever changed when any gun control measures have been changed. When Stephen Harper, put it this way, when Stephen Harper loosened the gun control regulations, the Toronto gun crime rate didn't change. When the Liberals strengthened it, Toronto gun crime has actually gone up this year. I'm not saying it's related, but it certainly hasn't dented it. So the things that governments are doing on this are having no frontline impact on the realities that are facing gang-related crimes in Toronto and other cities. And that's because these things are existing on a parallel track irrespective of the law. And you cannot legislate away these problems. You just can't, and you shouldn't even try, because you basically prey on people being conciliatory and feeling a level of collective responsibility when a shooting happens. And this is not solving any problems. It is not solving any problems. And again, I mean, these mass shootings are used to make it very difficult for someone to stand up and defend guns, because it looks like you're being callous, it looks like you're being insensitive, whereas I say no, because I know that legal gun ownership has nothing to do with these horrific killings, certainly not in Canada. So while I will mourn and pray and be sad about these things, I'm not going to shoulder any guilt for it, and I don't think any other Canadian should have to. I fundamentally reject that premise that's tried to that is attempted to be rammed down our throats by the left in Canada. The left does not want us to have guns, and they're going to use any excuse to justify putting a ban or a restriction in place. And I would pay very close attention to how that will be manifesting itself during the election campaign, because the Liberals have decided they'll kick the can to then, but if they win another term, we know we're going to be stuck with it, because it may not be possible to stop them, especially if they get a majority. Now, we'll have lots of opportunities between now and the election to predict the numbers. I don't want to get into that now, but I do want to, from a firearms ownership perspective, talk about what the stakes of these things really are. So glad to spend a bit of time doing that. I do want to make somewhat of a personal appeal, though, if I can here, because I've just laid out in this broadcast a few examples of where the media is not on side with firearms ownership. The Liberal parties are not. The NDP is not. The left culturally is not. There's an activist community that the media flocks to that is trying to take away gun ownership rights. And it does sometimes feel very lonely in this fight. There is a gun lobby, yes, but I'm not a gun lobby. I'm a journalist. I'm a commentator. And we cannot do this. We cannot advocate for you without your support, because we don't get the billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars that CBC gets, that mainstream media outlets in Canada get. Every dollar we get comes from you, comes from people that support the work that we're doing. It is tax deductible, so please do give us either a one-time contribution or join my Heritage Club, which comes with some benefits. There's a little description box in the corner there on Facebook, or if you're watching on YouTube, it's below. It's somewhere. Do click the link there to my Heritage Club and join. We can't do this alone, and I know that a lot of people talk about these issues, but we really need people that are prepared to go the next level. So I'm asking you, conservative to conservative in Canada, but freedom-loving person to freedom-loving person, and I use conservative with a small c there, please do support us if you can. My name is Andrew Lawton for True North. Thanks very much. God bless, and good day, Canada.